The clinking of champagne glasses usually marks a celebration, but at the Sterling family's annual foundation dinner, it became the sound of a life shattering. In front of New York's high society billionaire patriarch, a man who seemingly had it all raised his glass. But the woman he toasted wasn't his wife of 25 years, the mother of his children who had built his empire alongside him. It was a woman half her age, a stranger to them all. What followed was not just a scandal, but a war. A war for a name, a fortune, and a family. And by the next day, the battle lines would be drawn in the most shocking way imaginable. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a symphony of hushed murmurs and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, dripped light onto the assembled guests, a veritable who's who of New York's philanthropic and financial elite. At the center of it all, at the head of the most prominent table, sat the Sterling family. They were the sun around which this glittering solar system of wealth and influence revolved. At the head of the table, radiating an aura of untouchable power, was Richard Sterling. At 55, he was a man carved from granite and ambition, with a mane of silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was a self-made titan of industry, a man who had clawed his way from the grimy streets of Hell's Kitchen to the pinnacle of Manhattan's real estate world. His company Sterling Holdings owned a significant portion of the city's skyline, and his name was synonymous with audacious deals and ruthless success. He was a king in his kingdom, and tonight was his coronation. The annual Sterling Foundation Gala was the jewel in his philanthropic crown, a night where he gave back a fraction of his immense fortune with the kind of ostentatious generosity that only the truly wealthy can afford. Beside him, a study in quiet elegance and strained composure, was his wife, Catherine Sterling. At 50, she was still a breathtaking woman with classic patrician features, hair the color of spun gold, and eyes a startling shade of sapphire. She was born into old money, a scion of the prestigious Davenport family, and she had brought to their marriage a pedigree and a social grace that Richard, for all his billions, could never have acquired on his own. She was the perfect corporate wife, the silent partner who had smoothed his rough edges, hosted his endless dinners, and raised their 2 children while he conquered the world. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, a cascade of diamonds at her throat that had been a 25th anniversary gift from Richard. A gift she was beginning to realize that felt more like a severance package with each passing day. The chasm that had opened between them over the past few years was a silent gaping wound, a truth they both acknowledged but never dared to speak aloud. Across from them sat their children, the products of this gilded cage. 24-year-old Liam was the heir apparent, a younger, softer version of his father. He had Richard's ambition but lacked his killer instinct, a fact that was a constant source of friction between them. Liam, ever the dutiful son, had joined Sterling Holdings after graduating from Wharton, but he felt more like a highly paid subordinate than a future leader. He was handsome, charming, and desperate for his father's approval, a commodity that Richard dispensed with miserly reluctance. Next to Liam was his younger sister, 21-year-old Chloe. She was the family's resident firebrand, a passionate and idealistic art history major at Columbia, who viewed her father's world with a mixture of disdain and reluctant dependence. Chloe had her mother's beauty, but her father's defiant spirit, a combination that made her both captivating and perpetually at odds with her family's expectations. She loved her father, but she loathed what he represented, the cold, calculating world of money and power that she saw as a corrupting force. The dinner had been a carefully orchestrated performance, a series of speeches praising Richard's Midas touch and his supposed magnanimity. Catherine had played her part flawlessly, smiling, nodding, and exuding an air of serene pride as she listened to the endless litany of her husband's accomplishments. But beneath the surface, a cold dread was coiling in her stomach. She had seen the subtle shifts in Richard's behavior over the past year, The late nights he claimed were business meetings. The secretive phone calls he took in his study, the apathetic distance that had replaced the warmth in his eyes. She had suspected, of course. A woman always knows. But she had clung to a desperate hope that she was wrong, that the foundation they had built together was strong enough to withstand the tremors of his midlife crisis. The main course had been cleared, and the waiters were now moving with silent efficiency, refilling champagne glasses for the final toast of the evening. This was Richard's moment, the culmination of the night's adulation. He was expected to deliver a heartfelt speech thanking his supporters, his colleagues, and, of course, his loving family. He was expected to play the part of the benevolent patriarch, the man who had everything and was grateful for it. Richard rose from his chair, a glass of Dom Perignon in his hand. A hush fell over the ballroom as all eyes turned to him. He basked in the attention, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked every inch the conquering hero, the master of the universe. He began his speech with the usual platitudes, his voice a deep, confident baritone that resonated with power. He thanked the board of the foundation, the generous donors, the tireless staff. He spoke of his vision for the future, of the legacy he intended to build. Catherine watched him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had heard this speech 100 times before in 100 different ballrooms. It was a well-rehearsed script designed to charm and impress. But tonight something was different. There was a reckless, almost cruel glint in his eyes that she had never seen before. A sense of impending doom washed over her, so strong that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Liam and Chloe were also watching their father, their expressions a mixture of pride and apprehension. They too sensed that something was amiss. The air was thick with unspoken tension. A fragile silence stretched taut over the glittering room. Richard paused, taking a slow sip of his champagne. He let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic beat, his eyes sweeping across the sea of expectant faces. And then he did the unthinkable. His gaze shifted, moving past Catherine, past his children, to a table in the corner of the room. It was a table of lower-level executives from Sterling Holdings, the kind of people who were usually seated in the back, far from the center of power. But tonight one of them was about to be thrust into the spotlight. "But there is one more person I need to thank," Richard said, his voice dropping to a more intimate, almost caressing tone. "A person who has brought a new light into my life, a new passion, a new inspiration." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Catherine's blood ran cold. She followed his gaze, her eyes landing on a young woman seated at the corner table. The woman was beautiful in a way that was both obvious and slightly vulgar. She had long, raven-black hair, a voluptuous figure poured into a tight scarlet dress, and a look of triumphant arrogance on her face. Catherine had never seen her before, but she knew with a certainty that was as sharp and painful as a shard of glass in her heart who this woman was. This was her replacement. "To Ella," Richard declared, raising his glass high, "for showing me what it truly means to be alive." The name hung in the air, a poisoned dart that found its mark in the heart of the Sterling family. Ella. It was a name that would be seared into their memories forever. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a silence filled with shock, with outrage, with 1,000 unspoken questions. The guests stared, mouths agape, their eyes darting from Richard to Catherine to the scarlet woman who was now preening under the spotlight. The carefully constructed facade of the Sterling family had been shattered, and the raw, ugly truth was now laid bare for all to see. For Catherine, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The chandeliers above her blurred into a smear of light. The faces around her became distorted masks of pity and morbid curiosity. The air was thick and heavy, and she felt as if she were drowning. She looked at Richard, at the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and saw a stranger. His face was flushed with a mixture of arrogance and defiance, his eyes shining with a feverish light. He was not just acknowledging his affair, he was celebrating it, flaunting it in the most public and humiliating way possible. Liam was the first to react. He shot to his feet, his face pale with fury. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He looked from his father to the woman in red, a look of pure loathing on his face. Chloe was frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with horror. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at her mother, her expression a silent plea for this nightmare to end. But Richard was unfazed. He simply smiled, a cold, dismissive smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sit down, Liam," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Liam's voice rose, attracting the attention of the surrounding tables. "You're humiliating my mother in front of the entire city, and it doesn't concern me." The Scarlet Woman, Ella, seemed to revel in the drama. She stood up, a smug smile playing on her lips, and raised her own glass in a mock toast to Catherine. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a declaration of victory. That was the final straw for Catherine. The numbness that had enveloped her began to recede, replaced by a white-hot fury. She rose from her chair with a grace and dignity that belied the turmoil raging within her. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Ella. She looked at her children, her eyes filled with a strength and resolve that they had never seen before. Without a word, she turned and walked away from the table. She moved with a regal composure, her head held high, her back straight. The emerald gown shimmered around her like a suit of armor. She did not run. She did not cry. She simply walked with a purpose and a finality that was more powerful than any shouted words or shed tears. The entire ballroom watched her go, a silent collective witness to the public execution of a marriage. The murmurs started, then a rising tide of whispers and speculation. The Sterling Foundation Gala would be remembered not for its philanthropy, but for the scandal that had erupted at its heart. As Catherine walked through the grand lobby of the Pierre, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The life she had known for 25 years was over. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a cruel and reckless stranger. The future she had envisioned was a barren wasteland. She stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the city a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence of the ballroom. A lone tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of rage. Richard had declared war, and Catherine Sterling, the quiet, elegant wife, was about to become a warrior. The battle for the Sterling name, for her children, for her very identity, had just begun. The limousine ride back to the Sterling's palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse was a study in suffocating silence. The air, usually filled with the comfortable chatter of a family returning from a successful event, was now thick with a toxic mixture of shock, anger, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. Catherine sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights outside the tinted windows. She was a statue carved from ice, her face a mask of impenetrable composure. The single tear she had shed outside the hotel was the only outward sign of the tempest raging within her. Liam sat opposite her, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle throbbed in his cheek. He kept clenching and unclenching his fists, his knuckles white. He was a coiled spring of impotent fury, his eyes darting between his mother's stoic profile and the empty seat beside her, the seat where his father should have been. Richard, in a final act of brazen disrespect, had left the gala with Ella, their laughter echoing in the marble lobby as they disappeared into a waiting sports car, leaving his family to navigate the fallout of his public betrayal. Chloe was curled into the corner of the limousine, her small frame racked with silent sobs. She had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The sound of her weeping was a heartbreaking counterpoint to the tense silence, a raw, unfiltered expression of the pain they were all feeling. She was the family's emotional barometer, and right now she was indicating a storm of epic proportions. The doorman at their building, a man who had greeted them with a deferential smile for over a decade, averted his eyes as they stepped out of the car. The news, it seemed, had already traveled faster than the speed of light in the hyper-connected world of Manhattan's elite. The scandal was already a raging wildfire, and they were at the epicenter of the inferno. The penthouse, which had always been a symbol of their success and a sanctuary from the outside world, now felt like a gilded cage, its opulent furnishings and priceless art mocking them with their cold, indifferent beauty. The silence that had filled the car followed them into the apartment, amplifying the cavernous space and making it feel even more empty and desolate. Catherine walked directly to the bar, her movements precise and deliberate. She poured herself a generous measure of brandy, her hand steady. She took a long, slow sip, the fiery liquid a welcome burn in her throat. She needed its warmth to combat the icy chill that had settled deep in her bones. Liam finally broke the silence, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. "I can't believe him. I can't believe he would do that. To you. To us." Chloe lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "How could he? Mom! In front of everyone! Who is that woman?" Catherine turned to face her children, her expression softening for the first time that night. She saw their pain, their confusion, their shattered illusions, and a fierce protective love surged through her. They were the only thing that mattered now. "Her name apparently is Ella," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "And as for who she is, she's a mistake. A very public, very expensive mistake that your father has just made." She took another sip of her brandy, her mind already working, calculating, planning. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She had been a CEO's wife for 25 years. She knew how to strategize. She knew how to fight. "What are we going to do?" Liam asked, looking to his mother for guidance, his anger giving way to a sense of helplessness. He was used to his father being in control, making the decisions. Now that foundation had been ripped out from under him. "First," Catherine said, her voice firm, "we are going to stick together. Your father has made his choice. He has chosen to align himself with that woman. He has drawn a line in the sand. Now we must draw our own." She walked over to the large picture window that overlooked Central Park, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. She had stood at this window countless times, looking out at the empire she had helped Richard build. Now she was looking at a battlefield. "He thinks he's won," she said, her voice a low, dangerous murmur. "He thinks he can just discard me, discard us without any consequences. He has underestimated me. He has underestimated his own children." She turned back to them, her sapphire eyes burning with a newfound fire. "This is not just about a marriage anymore. This is about our family. It's about our name. It's about everything we've built. And I will not let him destroy it." The next morning, the city awoke to the Sterling scandal splashed across the front page of every tabloid and news site. "Sterling's Scarlet Night," screamed the headline of the New York Post, accompanied by a grainy photo of Richard and Ella leaving the gala, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. The article was a salacious mix of facts and speculation, detailing Richard's public toast, Catherine's dignified exit, and Ella's mysterious identity. She was painted as a young, ambitious marketing executive from Sterling Holdings, a vixen who had sunk her claws into the billionaire tycoon. The phones at the penthouse began to ring incessantly, a cacophony of calls from concerned friends, gossiping acquaintances, and reporters hungry for a quote. Catherine instructed the housekeeper to unplug them. She needed to think, to plan, to prepare for the war that was coming. She called a meeting with her personal lawyer, a shrewd and formidable woman named Jessica Davenport, who also happened to be her cousin. Jessica arrived within the hour, her face a mask of grim determination. She was a bulldog in a Chanel suit, and she was fiercely loyal to Catherine. They sat in the formal living room, the scene of so many happy family gatherings, now transformed into a war room. Catherine, with a clarity that surprised even herself, laid out the events of the previous night, her voice calm and measured. She did not cry. She did not rage. She presented the facts with the detached precision of a surgeon. Jessica listened intently, her pen flying across her legal pad. When Catherine had finished, she looked up, her expression a mixture of sympathy and steely resolve. "He's a fool, Catherine. A monumental, arrogant fool, but he's a dangerous fool. We need to move quickly and decisively." "I want a divorce," Catherine said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "But I want more than that. I helped him build that company. My family's money was the seed that started it all. My social connections opened doors for him that would have otherwise been bolted shut. I am not just his wife. I am his partner. And I will not be discarded like a piece of outdated furniture." Jessica nodded, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Under New York law, marital assets are subject to equitable distribution. And we will argue that your contributions to the marriage and to the business were significant. We will go after half of everything, Catherine. The company, the properties, the art collection, everything." "Good," Catherine said. "But there's more. I want to protect the children. Liam's position at the company, Chloe's trust fund. He will try to use them as leverage against me. I know he will. We'll file for an immediate injunction to freeze all marital assets," Jessica said. "That will prevent him from moving money around or making any major financial decisions without court approval. We'll also petition for temporary spousal and child support. We'll hit him hard and fast before he has time to fully comprehend what's happening." While Catherine was plotting her legal strategy, Liam was facing his own battle. He had gone to the office against his mother's advice, determined to confront his father. He found Richard in his corner office, a vast expanse of glass and steel with a panoramic view of the city. He was on the phone, laughing, a sound that made Liam's blood boil. Ella was perched on the edge of his desk, looking as if she owned the place. She was wearing a dress that was even more revealing than the one from the night before, and she was sipping a latte from a Sterling Holdings mug. When Richard saw Liam, his expression hardened. He ended the call and stood up, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. "What do you want, Liam?" he asked, his voice cold and dismissive. "I want to know what you were thinking," Liam said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I want to know how you could do that to Mom." Richard scoffed, a look of pure arrogance on his face. "Your mother and I have been unhappy for years. It was a charade, a business arrangement. It's time for me to be happy. Ella makes me happy." Ella smiled, a smug, triumphant smile. "Your father is a passionate man, Liam. He needs a woman who can keep up with him." The condescending tone, the casual disrespect, it was too much for Liam to bear. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You've just destroyed this family." "Don't be so dramatic," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a divorce. It happens every day. Your mother will be well taken care of. You and Chloe will be fine. Nothing has to change." "Nothing has to change." Liam's voice rose to a shout. "You just publicly humiliated the woman who has stood by you for 25 years, and you think nothing has to change. You've lost your mind." "Watch your tone, Liam," Richard warned, his eyes narrowing. "You're an employee of this company, and I am still your father." "No," Liam said, a sudden chilling clarity descending upon him. "You're not. Not anymore. The man I called my father wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have been so cruel, so selfish." He took a step back, his decision made in that moment of painful disillusionment. "I quit," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I will not work for you. I will not be a part of this circus." He turned and walked out of the office, ignoring Richard's bellow of his name. He walked past the curious stares of the other employees, past the whispers and the pitying looks. He walked out of Sterling Holdings, the company he had once believed was his birthright, and he did not look back. Meanwhile, Chloe was waging her own more subtle war. She had spent the morning on the phone, not with friends, but with the trustees of the Davenport Family Foundation, the charitable organization established by her maternal grandparents. She was a junior board member, a position she had always taken seriously. She knew the inner workings of the foundation, and she knew where the pressure points were. She spoke with her great-aunt, the formidable matriarch of the Davenport clan, a woman who had never fully approved of Richard Sterling. Chloe, with a passion and eloquence that belied her years, painted a vivid picture of Richard's public betrayal of his cruelty, of his disrespect for the family name. She spoke not just as a grieving daughter, but as a Davenport defending the honor of their lineage. By the time she hung up the phone, the wheels were in motion. The Davenport family, a powerful and influential force in their own right, was mobilizing. They were cutting ties with Richard, both personal and professional. They were withdrawing their support from his ventures, closing doors that had once been held wide open. They were in their own quiet, devastating way declaring war on Richard Sterling. When Liam arrived back at the penthouse, his face pale but resolute, he found his mother and sister in the living room. He told them what he had done, that he had quit his job, that he had walked away from his father. Catherine looked at him, a fierce pride in her eyes. "You did the right thing, Liam," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You chose your family. You chose your integrity." Chloe then told them about her own conversations, about the Davenport family's response. A small, grim smile touched Catherine's lips. The battle lines were being drawn, and she was not fighting alone. The next day, the family gathered in the living room, a united front against the storm that was about to break. Jessica arrived with a mountain of paperwork, the first salvos in their legal war. The divorce petition, the injunction to freeze assets, the request for spousal support. It was all there ready to be filed. As they were reviewing the documents, the doorman buzzed up. "Mr. Sterling is on his way up," he announced, his voice strained. A cold silence fell over the room. Catherine looked at her children, her expression unreadable. "Let him come," she said, her voice calm. "It's time we had a family meeting." Richard strode into the apartment a few minutes later, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He was not used to being defied. He was not used to his authority being questioned. He was a king who had just discovered that his kingdom was in revolt. He glared at Jessica, at the pile of legal documents on the coffee table. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "It's a divorce petition, Richard," Catherine said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "And an injunction to freeze all our assets. You will not be spending another dime of our money on that woman." Richard's face contorted with fury. He turned to Liam. "And you pathetic, ungrateful whelp, you walk out on my company, on your future." "I walked out on you," Liam corrected, his voice steady. "I chose my mother. I chose my family." Richard then turned his wrath on Chloe. "And you went crying to your ancient relatives, turning them against me." "I told them the truth," Chloe said, her voice unwavering. "You're the one who brought this on yourself." Richard looked from one defiant face to another, a dawning realization in his eyes. He had expected them to crumble. He had expected them to be weak, to be dependent on him. He had never imagined that they would stand together, that they would fight back. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You think you can win this? You think you can take me on? I built this empire. I am Richard Sterling." "And I am Catherine Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an unshakable strength. "And these are our children. You made a choice, Richard. You chose her." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the city, a dismissive wave of her hand. "And now we have made our choice. We choose each other. We choose this family." The battle had been joined. The lines had been drawn. And in the opulent penthouse overlooking Central Park, the Sterling family minus its patriarch stood united, ready to face the storm. The next day had come, and the family had chosen. They had chosen her. They had chosen Catherine. They had chosen themselves. And Richard Sterling, the king who had so carelessly discarded his queen, was about to discover that he was no longer ruling a kingdom, but a wasteland of his own making. The war had just begun, and the casualties were yet to be counted. The weeks that followed the fateful dinner were a blur of legal maneuvering, public scrutiny, and a profound seismic shift in the Sterling family's universe. The battle that Richard had so arrogantly ignited was now a full-blown war fought not on a battlefield of mud and steel, but in the sterile conference rooms of law firms, the gossip columns of the city's tabloids, and the hushed, judgmental circles of New York's elite. Richard, accustomed to a world that bent to his will, was stunned by the ferocity and unity of the opposition. He had expected Catherine to be a weeping, broken woman, begging for a reconciliation or a quiet, generous settlement. He had expected his children to be petulant, but ultimately compliant, their dependence on his wealth a leash he could easily tug. He had fundamentally misjudged them, and that miscalculation was proving to be a costly one. The injunction freezing their assets was the first major blow. It was a strategic masterstroke by Jessica Davenport, a legal chokehold that brought Richard's freewheeling financial life to a screeching halt. Suddenly, every major transaction, every transfer of funds required court approval. His plan to set Ella up in a lavish multi-million-dollar condo to shower her with the kind of extravagant gifts that would solidify her position as the new woman in his life was abruptly thwarted. He was a king with a temporarily locked treasury, and the humiliation was exquisite. He retaliated, as was his nature, with brute force. He assembled a legal team of the most ruthless, high-priced sharks in the city, lawyers known for their scorched earth tactics. They filed a counter-petition accusing Catherine of being a gold digger, a woman who had lived a life of luxury on his dime and was now trying to bleed him dry. They painted her as a cold, calculating woman who had been emotionally distant for years, a wife in name only. It was a smear campaign designed to wound and intimidate. But Catherine, buoyed by the unwavering support of her children, and the formidable Jessica, refused to be cowed. She had spent 25 years in Richard's shadow, her own intelligence and strength sublimated to his ego. Now that shadow was gone, and she was stepping into the light, discovering a resilience she never knew she possessed. The public narrative which Richard had assumed he could control was also turning against him. His brazen toast to his mistress had been a public relations disaster, a display of such breathtaking arrogance that it had alienated even his most ardent supporters. The story of Catherine's dignified exit of her children's loyalty had captured the city's imagination. She was cast as the wronged woman, the graceful matriarch defending her family's honor. He was the villain, the callous billionaire who had traded his loyal wife for a younger, flashier model. The other woman, Ella, was also finding that her victory was not as sweet as she had imagined. She had craved the spotlight, the legitimacy that came with being on the arm of a man like Richard Sterling. But the spotlight was now a harsh, unforgiving glare. She was vilified in the press, branded a homewrecker and a social climber. The wives of Richard's friends and business associates, women who had once been her colleagues or superiors, now looked at her with undisguised contempt. She was a pariah, a scarlet woman in a city that prized loyalty and discretion above all else. The war for the Sterling Empire was also being fought on a more personal and perhaps more painful front. Richard, enraged by his children's defiance, began to turn the screws. He cut off their credit cards, a petty act of retaliation that was more symbolic than financially devastating. He sent a curt, formal letter to Chloe informing her that he would no longer be contributing to her tuition at Columbia. He tried to bar Liam from the family's country home in the Hamptons, a place filled with a lifetime of memories. But for every move he made, Catherine had a countermove. She used her own personal funds, a substantial inheritance from her parents that Richard had never been able to touch, to cover Chloe's tuition and ensure that her children's lives were not disrupted. She reminded Richard through Jessica that the Hamptons house was a marital asset and he had no legal right to bar his own son from the property. The children, for their part, were discovering their own strengths in the crucible of this family crisis. Liam, freed from the suffocating pressure of his father's expectations, began to explore his own interests. He had always had a passion for sustainable architecture, an idea that Richard had dismissed as tree-hugging nonsense. Now he started taking online courses, networking with people in the field, and even sketching out plans for his own small, eco-friendly development company. He was finding a purpose that was entirely his own, a sense of self-worth that was not tied to the Sterling name or his father's approval. Chloe, always the family's conscience, channeled her anger and hurt into her activism. She became even more involved in her art history studies, focusing on the role of female artists, who had been overlooked or marginalized by their male counterparts. She saw a parallel in her mother's story, and it fueled her passion. She organized a student art exhibition on campus, showcasing the work of up-and-coming female artists, and dedicated it to her mother. It was a small act of defiance, but it was a powerful statement of her loyalty and her values. The standoff continued for months, a tense and bitter war of attrition. The legal bills mounted, the emotional toll grew, and the chasm within the family deepened into an unbridgeable canyon. Richard, isolated and increasingly paranoid, became more and more dependent on Ella. But the foundations of their relationship, built on a reckless impulse and a shared desire for a certain kind of lifestyle, were beginning to show cracks. Ella was growing impatient. The life of a pampered billionaire's mistress was not materializing as she had envisioned. The frozen assets meant that the shopping sprees, the lavish trips, the jewelry were all on hold. She was living in a luxury hotel, a gilded cage, but she was not the mistress of a Fifth Avenue penthouse. She was a woman in limbo, and the constant public scrutiny was beginning to wear on her. She had wanted to be a queen, but she was beginning to feel more like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. The turning point came during a deposition for the divorce case. It was the first time that Catherine and Richard had been in the same room since that fateful night at the penthouse. The air in the conference room was thick with animosity, a palpable living thing. Richard's lawyers, true to their reputation, came out swinging. They questioned Catherine about her spending habits, her social life, her role as a mother. They tried to paint her as a frivolous, detached woman who had contributed nothing to the marriage but her pedigree. Catherine, cool and composed, answered their questions with a quiet dignity that infuriated them. She had her own secret weapon, a collection of meticulously kept diaries that she had maintained for 25 years. They were a detailed record of her life with Richard. A chronicle of the dinner parties she had hosted, the business trips she had organized, the clients she had wooed, the personal sacrifices she had made. When it was Jessica's turn to question Richard, she was relentless. She presented him with evidence of his lavish spending on Ella, of his attempts to hide assets, of his emotional cruelty to his wife and children. Richard, under oath, was forced to admit to his infidelity, to his lies, to his callous disregard for his family. But the most devastating blow came when Jessica began to question him about the early days of his company. She produced financial records, old loan agreements, and personal letters that Catherine had saved. She laid out in painstaking detail how the initial seed money for Sterling Holdings had come not from Richard's own pocket, but from a trust fund established by Catherine's grandfather. She showed how Catherine's family connections had secured him his first major development deal, a deal that had been the launching pad for his entire empire. Richard, for the first time in his life, was speechless. The narrative he had so carefully constructed, the myth of the self-made man, was crumbling around him. He was not just a philanderer, he was a fraud. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of his wife's money and her family's influence. The news of the deposition, of the revelations about the origins of Richard's fortune, sent shockwaves through the business community. His reputation, already tarnished, was now in tatters. His business partners began to distance themselves, his stock price wavered, and the empire he had built with such ruthless determination began to seem vulnerable. For Richard, it was the ultimate humiliation. He had lost his family, his reputation, and now he was in danger of losing his company. He was a king in a kingdom that was rapidly shrinking, his power and influence draining away like sand through his fingers. Ella, seeing the writing on the wall, made her move. She realized that the Sterling ship was taking on water and she had no intention of going down with it. She gave an exclusive tell-all interview to a tabloid magazine, painting herself as a victim, a naive young woman who had been seduced and manipulated by a powerful older man. She portrayed Richard as a Svengali figure, a man who had promised her the world and then left her with nothing. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, a final desperate attempt to salvage her own reputation at his expense. The interview was the final nail in Richard's coffin. He was now not just a villain, but a pathetic one. He was a man who had been outplayed by his wife, abandoned by his children, and now publicly betrayed by his mistress. He was alone, isolated in his glass and steel tower, a king with no subjects, no allies, and no one to blame but himself. In the end, he had no choice but to surrender. He agreed to a settlement that was far more generous to Catherine than anything he had ever imagined. She received a significant portion of his fortune, the Fifth Avenue penthouse, the Hamptons house, and a substantial stake in Sterling Holdings. It was not just a victory, it was a vindication. Catherine, Liam, and Chloe stood together on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out at the city that was once again theirs. The war was over. They were bruised, they were scarred, but they were whole. They had faced the storm and had emerged not unscathed but stronger, more united, and with a clearer sense of who they were and what they valued. Catherine Sterling, the woman who had been publicly discarded, had not just survived, she had triumphed. She had reclaimed her name, her fortune, and her family. She was no longer just the wife of a billionaire. She was the matriarch of a new Sterling dynasty, one built not on ruthless ambition and public spectacle, but on loyalty, integrity, and the enduring power of family. The battle had been won not with a shout, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. And in the end, that had been the most powerful weapon of all. The aftermath of the Sterling divorce was as closely watched as the initial scandal, but for entirely different reasons. It became a story not of betrayal, but of reinvention. Catherine, now one of the wealthiest women in New York, did not retreat into a life of quiet luxury. Instead, she stepped into a new public role with a grace and purpose that surprised everyone except perhaps her children. She took her seat on the board of Sterling Holdings not as a silent partner, but as an active and influential voice. Her knowledge of the company's history, her innate understanding of the city's social and political landscape, and her newfound confidence made her a formidable presence. She championed a new direction for the company, one that focused on sustainable development, community engagement, and ethical business practices. It was a vision that resonated with a new generation of investors and clients, and under her guidance the company began to regain its footing, its reputation slowly being rebuilt on a foundation of integrity rather than arrogance. Liam, with his mother's backing and a substantial investment from her settlement, launched his own company, Sterling Green. It was a small boutique firm specializing in environmentally conscious urban design. His first project was a low-income housing development in the Bronx, a building that incorporated green roofs, solar panels, and community gardens. It was a project that would have made his father scoff, but it earned Liam the respect of his peers and a sense of fulfillment that he had never found in the corporate world of Sterling Holdings. He was building something that was not just profitable but meaningful. Chloe, graduating from Columbia with honors, turned down lucrative job offers from major auction houses and galleries. Instead, she used a portion of her trust fund, now securely under her mother's control, to establish the Davenport Sterling Arts Foundation. Its mission was to provide grants and mentorship to emerging female artists, the very people she had championed in her student exhibition. She became a passionate and articulate advocate for the arts, a patron who was more interested in nurturing talent than in acquiring trophies. The Sterling family, once a symbol of fractured wealth and public scandal, was now being redefined. They were becoming known for their philanthropy, their commitment to social responsibility, their quiet but powerful influence. They were a family that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and had emerged stronger, more united, and with a shared sense of purpose. And what of Richard? He became a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted the corridors of power he had once dominated. His personal fortune was diminished, his reputation in ruins. The men who had once courted his favor now avoided his calls. The women who had once vied for his attention now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a man adrift, a king without a kingdom. He traveled, he bought expensive toys, he dated a string of ever younger women, but he could not escape the shadow of his own actions. He had had it all. A beautiful, intelligent wife, loving children, a vast empire. And he had thrown it all away for a fleeting moment of ego-driven passion. He would sometimes see his family in the society pages, their names now associated with worthy causes and successful ventures. He would see Catherine looking more radiant and confident than ever before a woman who had not just survived his betrayal, but had thrived in its wake. He would see Liam, his face filled with a purpose and a passion that he had never seen in him before. He would see Chloe, a fierce and independent woman who was making her own mark on the world. And in those moments, in the lonely silence of his gilded exile, he would be forced to confront the full weight of his loss. He had toasted his mistress and ignored his wife, and in doing so, he had not just lost a marriage, he had lost his family, his legacy, and a part of himself that he would never be able to reclaim. The Sterling name lived on, but it was no longer his. It belonged to them, to the family that had chosen each other, that had chosen to build a new future from the ashes of the past. The real Sterling empire, he was beginning to understand, was not built of glass and steel, but of love, loyalty, and a resilience that he had so foolishly underestimated. He had won the battle for Ella, but he had lost the war for everything that truly mattered. And that was a defeat from which he would never recover. That was the story of the Sterling family, a story of how one man's betrayal became a catalyst for three people's transformation. It's a reminder that true wealth isn't measured in billions, but in loyalty, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of family. What did you think of Catherine's journey from a scorned wife to a powerful matriarch? Do you believe Richard got what he deserved in the end? We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. They say for better or for worse in sickness and in health. For Lillian Hayes, in sickness meant a sterile white room, the rhythmic pulse of machines her only companion. She believed her husband, the magnate Anthony Hayes, was continents away, closing a deal that would add another zero to their already staggering fortune. She pictured him in boardrooms, his charismatic presence commanding respect. But Anthony was much closer to home. And while Lillian fought for her life, another woman was living hers in Lillian's house, sleeping in her bed, and rearranging the memories of a lifetime, completely unaware that the true queen of the castle was not only alive, but held the key to the kingdom in a way no one could ever imagine. The scent of antiseptic clung to everything in room 312 of the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. It was a smell Lillian had come to associate with survival, a sterile perfume that masked the cloying sweetness of the lilies Anthony sent every other day. They were always white, always perfect, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the life she'd put on hold. For 3 long months, this pristine, unnervingly quiet room had been her world. A rare and aggressive form of pneumonia had ambushed her, leaving her tethered to a web of tubes and monitors, her breath a shallow, hard-won victory. Her husband, Anthony Hayes, was a man whose name was synonymous with success. A real estate mogul who had sculpted the Los Angeles skyline, he was a figure of immense power and charisma. His photograph, a dashing black-and-white portrait from their early years, sat on her bedside table. In it, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a promise of forever. He called every day his voice a smooth baritone that traveled across continents, or so she thought. He was in Singapore, he'd said, finalizing the deal of a lifetime. A multi-billion-dollar hotel and residence project that would be the crown jewel of his empire. "I miss you, my love," he'd murmur, his voice laced with a convincing blend of longing and regret. "Every second is an eternity. But this is for us, for our future." Lillian would close her eyes and picture him in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the Marina Bay Sands, his bespoke Tom Ford suit immaculate, his presence commanding. She'd imagine him returning to a lonely suite at the Fullerton Bay Hotel, the city lights twinkling below a pale imitation of the stars they used to watch from the observatory at their Bel Air estate. She never once doubted him. Theirs was a love story whispered about in the elite circles of Los Angeles. Anthony, the self-made billionaire, and Lillian, the brilliant architect who had been his partner in every sense of the word. They had met at a charity gala, a whirlwind of champagne and polite conversation. He had been captivated by her sharp wit, and the way her eyes, a warm, intelligent brown, seemed to see right through the facade of wealth and power that surrounded him. Their life together was a tapestry woven with threads of gold and silver. Their Bel Air mansion, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa nestled in the hills, was a testament to their shared taste and success. It was a house Lillian had poured her heart into, not just as a resident but as a designer. She had worked alongside the renowned architect Harrison Sinclair to create a space that was both opulent and intimate, a sanctuary from the relentless demands of their public lives. The house on Bellagio Road was more than just a property. It was a living, breathing entity, each room a chapter of their story. The grand library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves housed first editions of her favorite classics and his collection of antique maps. The master bedroom with its panoramic views of the city was where they had dreamed up their future, their whispers mingling with the distant hum of Los Angeles. But now, as Lillian lay in her hospital bed, the silence of her gilded cage was deafening. Her recovery was slow, a painstaking process of rebuilding her strength one breath at a time. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the road ahead was long. She missed the feel of the cool marble beneath her feet, the scent of the jasmine that climbed the walls of their garden, the familiar weight of Anthony's arm around her as they watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She had no idea that while she was fighting for every breath, another woman was breathing in the air of her home, her scent slowly, insidiously replacing Lillian's. Her name was Sienna, a name as vibrant and fiery as the woman herself. She was an aspiring actress, a supernova of ambition and beauty who had caught Anthony's eye at a dimly lit bar in West Hollywood. To Sienna, Anthony was a godsend. He was her ticket out of a cramped walk-up apartment in Koreatown and into a world she had only ever seen in magazines. He had swept her off her feet with a whirlwind of lavish dinners at Spago Beverly Hills, impromptu trips to Napa Valley in his private jet, and gifts that left her breathless. A classic Chanel 255 handbag, a diamond necklace from Harry Winston, a vintage Rolex that had once belonged to a Hollywood legend. Anthony had been careful at first. Their affair was a clandestine dance of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. But as Lillian's hospital stay stretched from weeks into months, his caution began to fray at the edges. The lie of his Singapore trip had become a convenient shroud, a cloak of invisibility that allowed him to live a double life. One evening, after a particularly intoxicating dinner fueled by vintage Bordeaux and the heady thrill of their illicit romance, Anthony made a reckless decision. Sienna had been complaining about her apartment, the noisy neighbors, the plumbing that seemed to have a mind of its own. "I can't bear the thought of you in that place," Anthony had said, his voice a low, seductive rumble. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "My house. It's empty. Just sitting there. I'm in Singapore after all." He'd smiled a slow, deliberate smile that made her heart race. "Why don't you stay there, just for a little while, until I get back?" Sienna's eyes had widened. The Bel Air mansion, the one she had only ever seen in the glossy pages of Architectural Digest, it was a fantasy, a dream she had never dared to entertain. "But your wife?" She had stammered, a flicker of apprehension in her emerald eyes. Anthony had waved a dismissive hand. "She's away, visiting her sister on the East Coast, an extended trip. The house is empty, I promise." It was a lie, of course, a new layer added to the elaborate fiction he had constructed. He had justified it to himself, a temporary solution to a temporary problem. Lillian would never have to know. And so Sienna had moved in. She had arrived at the imposing gates of the Bellagio Road estate in a taxi, her few belongings packed into 2 oversized suitcases. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been with the Hayes family for decades, had greeted her with a look of thinly veiled disapproval. But Anthony's instructions had been clear. Miss Dubois was to be treated as a guest with all the courtesies that entailed. The house was even more breathtaking than Sienna had imagined. It was a palace, a labyrinth of marble floors, soaring ceilings, and priceless art. She had wandered through the rooms in a daze, her fingers trailing over the cool, smooth surfaces of the custom-made furniture. She had twirled in the center of the grand ballroom, her laughter echoing in the vast, empty space. She had made her way to the master suite, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was Lillian's room. Lillian's bed. She had hesitated for a moment, a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, piercing through her euphoria. But then she had pushed it aside, the intoxicating scent of Anthony's cologne lingering in the air, a potent aphrodisiac. She had opened the walk-in closet, a room the size of her entire apartment, and gasped. Rows upon rows of designer clothes, a rainbow of silks and cashmeres hung in pristine order. Shoes, hundreds of them, were displayed like works of art. Handbags from every luxury brand imaginable lined the shelves. It was a treasure trove, a fashionista's paradise. And as Sienna slipped into one of Lillian's silk robes, its fabric cool and sensual against her skin, she felt a sense of ownership, a thrilling, audacious belief that this was where she belonged. She was no longer the struggling actress from Koreatown. She was the mistress of a Bel Air mansion, the woman of a millionaire's dreams. She had no idea that the woman whose life she was so casually inhabiting was just a few miles away, fighting for her own. And she had no idea that the deed to this magnificent house, the very foundation of her newfound fantasy, held a secret that would shatter her world and Anthony's in a way neither of them could ever have foreseen. The name on the deed was not Anthony Hayes. It was Lillian's, and Lillian's alone. A secret she had kept, a trump card she had never intended to play. But the game, as she was about to discover, had changed, and the rules were about to be rewritten. The first sign that something was amiss came not from a dramatic confession or a slip of the tongue, but from a mundane detail, a single out-of-place thread in the carefully woven tapestry of Anthony's deceit. It was a charge on his American Express Centurion card statement, a card Lillian had access to, a detail Anthony in his arrogance had overlooked. Lillian was finally on the mend. The doctors had been amazed by her resilience, the fierce tenacity with which she had clung to life. She was still weak, her body a pale shadow of its former self, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She was sitting up in her hospital bed, a laptop perched on her knees, catching up on the minutiae of a life that had been on pause. She was scrolling through their joint account, a habit born of years of managing their shared finances, when she saw it. A charge from a small, exclusive floral boutique in Beverly Hills called Le Jardin Privé. It wasn't the amount that caught her attention, a mere few $100s a drop in the ocean of their expenditure. It was the name. Anthony knew she was allergic to the particular type of orchid that was the boutique's specialty. He had made that mistake once early in their relationship, and the memory of her swollen eyes and hives had been seared into his memory. He would never buy her flowers from there. A small, cold knot of unease began to form in the pit of her stomach. She tried to dismiss it, a simple mistake, perhaps an assistant's error. But the unease lingered, a persistent whisper in the back of her mind. She clicked on the transaction details, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. The delivery address was not the hospital. It was their home, on Bellagio Road. The room suddenly felt colder, the rhythmic beep of the monitor a frantic, insistent pulse. Why would he send flowers to an empty house? Unless it wasn't empty. The thought, once it had taken root, began to grow, its tendrils wrapping around her heart, squeezing the air from her lungs. She remembered a conversation from a few weeks ago, a strained, stilted call with Mrs. Gable. Lillian had called to check on the house, and the housekeeper had been uncharacteristically evasive. "Is everything all right, Martha?" Lillian had asked, a note of concern in her voice. There had been a long pause on the other end of the line. "Everything is fine, Mrs. Hayes. Just as you left it." But her voice had been tight, her words clipped. At the time, Lillian had attributed it to the housekeeper's general stoicism, her dislike of small talk. But now, in the harsh light of this new unsettling discovery, the conversation took on a sinister new meaning. Lillian's hands trembled as she typed in the name of the boutique, her search engine pulling up its Instagram page. Her breath hitched in her throat. There on the boutique's feed was a photograph of a stunning, ostentatious arrangement of the very orchids she was allergic to. The caption read, "A special delivery for a special lady. Welcome to the neighborhood, Sienna." The post was tagged with the location Bel Air. Sienna. The name was a shard of glass in her heart. She didn't know who this woman was, but she knew with a chilling, gut-wrenching certainty what she was. The mistress. His mistress. In her house. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the sterile white walls of the hospital room closing in on her. The betrayal was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left her gasping for air. The image of Anthony, the man she loved, the man she had built a life with, shattered into a million pieces. The man who had called her every day, his voice thick with a feigned longing, had been lying to her. Every word a carefully crafted deception. Her grief was a tidal wave, a raw, primal force that threatened to consume her. But then something else rose to the surface. Something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. Rage. A slow-burning fury that solidified the shattered pieces of her heart into a weapon. She had to see for herself. She had to know. That afternoon, against the frantic protests of her doctors and nurses, Lillian Hayes discharged herself from the hospital. She was still fragile, her body a battlefield of her recent illness, but her resolve was forged in steel. She called her most trusted confidant, her lawyer and friend, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Reed. "I need a favor, Evelyn." Lillian said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil that raged within her. "And I need you to ask no questions." An hour later, a discreet black town car pulled up to a side entrance of the hospital. Lillian, dressed in a simple but elegant Chanel tracksuit, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering light, slipped into the back seat. The drive to Bel Air was a blur. The familiar streets, once a source of comfort and nostalgia, now seemed alien, tinged with the bitter taste of betrayal. As they turned onto Bellagio Road, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and anticipation. She had Evelyn instruct the driver to park a little way down the street, hidden from view by a thicket of bougainvillea. From her vantage point, she could see the front of her house, her beautiful, sprawling villa, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. And then she saw her. Sienna. She was lounging by the pool, a vision of youthful, sun-kissed perfection. She was wearing one of Lillian's bikinis, a vibrant heiress creation that Lillian had bought for a trip to St. Bart's they had never taken. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her emerald eyes sparkling. And beside her on a sun lounger was Anthony. He was not in Singapore. He was here in their home with this woman. He was leaning towards her, his expression one of rapt adoration, the same look he used to give Lillian. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her fiery red hair behind her ear, his touch lingering and intimate. The scene was a knife in Lillian's heart, twisting and turning, each movement a fresh wave of agony. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest as Anthony leaned in and kissed Sienna, a long, languid kiss that spoke of a deep and familiar intimacy. In that moment, something inside Lillian broke. The love, the trust, the shared history, all of it dissolved into a bitter, corrosive acid. The woman who had been fighting for her life in a hospital bed was gone. In her place was a woman who was fighting for something else entirely: justice. Revenge. She turned to Evelyn, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "The house," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The deed. Is it still in my name? And my name alone?" Evelyn, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and professional detachment, nodded. "Yes, Lillian. The house is yours. It was a premarital asset, and we made sure it was ironclad. Anthony has no legal claim to it whatsoever." A slow, chilling smile spread across Lillian's face. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that promised a reckoning. "Good," she said, her voice regaining its strength, its authority. "Because I want them out. Both of them. And I want to be the one to do it." The plan was simple: elegant, and ruthless. It was a plan born of a broken heart and a brilliant mind, a plan that would dismantle Anthony's carefully constructed world piece by piece. She would not storm in a screaming, hysterical wife. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She would play the long game. She would let him believe he was in control, that his secrets were safe. She instructed Evelyn to draw up the necessary paperwork, a formal eviction notice. It was a cold legal document devoid of emotion, a stark black and white declaration of her ownership and her intent. And then she waited. She returned to the hospital, a meek, compliant patient once more, the fury in her eyes carefully concealed behind a mask of weary resignation. She took Anthony's calls, her voice soft and placid, betraying none of the storm that raged within her. "I miss you," he would say, his voice a silken lie. "I miss you too," she would reply, the words like ash in her mouth. She was biding her time, gathering her strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The queen was about to retake her castle, and the usurpers, basking in the warmth of their stolen paradise, had no idea that a storm was coming, a storm that would wash them away, leaving nothing but the wreckage of their lives in its wake. The day Lillian chose for her return was a Tuesday, a day of bland, unassuming normalcy, utterly devoid of the high drama it was about to host. For 2 weeks she had been a ghost haunting the sterile corridors of Cedars-Sinai, her body healing while her mind sharpened into a razor's edge. Each day she played the part of the compliant patient, her fragility a masterful disguise for the cold, calculating fury that was coalescing in her soul. Each night she meticulously planned her reclamation not as a spurned wife, but as a sovereign ruler preparing to quell a rebellion. When she was discharged that morning, the doctors praised her remarkable resilience. They saw a woman frail from illness, but her eyes, which they mistook as weary, held the glint of forged steel. She didn't call for a discreet town car or a taxi. Instead, she had her personal Bentley, a formidable silver ghost, delivered to the hospital's private exit. Sliding behind the wheel, the familiar scent of worn leather and her own subtle perfume was the first act of taking back her life. The engine purred to life with a low, predatory growl, a sound that resonated with the awakening power inside her. The drive to Bel Air was a surreal journey through a life that was no longer hers. The sun-drenched boulevards, the towering palms, the familiar gates of a world she had once commanded, it all felt alien-tainted. As she turned onto Bellagio Road, her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This wasn't a homecoming. It was an invasion. She didn't announce her arrival. She didn't sweep up the grand driveway to the main entrance. Instead, she parked on a quiet side street and entered through the garden gate using her own key. The click of the lock was a small, satisfying sound, the first note in her symphony of retribution. The silence that greeted her inside was the most unnerving thing of all. It was a dead quiet, the natural hum of the house stifled. The air, which should have carried the clean, subtle scent of the Joe Malone lime basil and mandarin candles she favored, was thick with a foreign perfume, a cloying, overly sweet floral that seemed to cling to the velvet drapes and seep into the marble floors. It was the scent of an intruder. By the grand, sweeping staircase, a pair of brazenly red stiletto heels lay discarded, a flash of scarlet sin against the pristine white marble. They were cheap, garish, and so utterly out of place they might as well have been a flag planted by a conquering army. Every detail was a fresh wound, another twist of the knife that only hardened her resolve. She followed the faint sound of music, a vapid pop song, its bass thumping softly from the direction of the library. Her sanctuary. The room filled with first editions and the scent of old paper and leather, the one place in the world she had felt truly at peace. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open silently and stood in the threshold, a spectral figure cloaked in righteous fury. And she watched. They were on the deep green Chesterfield sofa, the one her grandfather had given her, the one where she and Anthony had dreamed of their future. They weren't just kissing. It was a desperate, fevered entanglement, a tangle of limbs and hungry mouths. He was devouring the woman beneath him, a fiery redhead whose silk robe had fallen open, revealing the smooth, pale skin of her back. Lillian registered with a strange, detached coldness that the robe was hers. It was a custom-made piece from La Perla, a gift from Anthony on their 5th anniversary. The pain she expected, the raw, visceral agony of witnessing the ultimate betrayal, was strangely muted. It was there, a deep tectonic ache beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by an immense crystalline calm. It was the eye of the storm, a place of pure, unadulterated focus. This was not a moment for tears. It was a moment for judgment. She let the silence stretch, allowing them to marinate in their sordid little world for a few seconds longer. Then she cleared her throat. It wasn't a loud sound, not a gasp or a sob, but a soft, perfectly modulated ahem that sliced through the cloying pop music like a guillotine. The effect was instantaneous. They sprang apart as if electrocuted, their faces a comical tableau of horror and disbelief. Sienna scrambled to pull the silk robe around her, her face flushing a blotchy, panicked red. Anthony's head whipped around, and when he saw Lillian standing there, all the color drained from his handsome face. He looked as though he had seen an apparition, a specter summoned from the grave to haunt him. Lillian. He breathed, his voice a strangled, pathetic rasp. My God. What? What are you doing here, I thought. The hospital. You thought I was in the hospital? Lillian finished for him, her voice as cool and smooth as the marble in the foyer. She took a deliberate step into the room, her presence instantly commanding the space. Her eyes, cold and unflinching, flicked from his face to the woman cowering on the sofa. You thought I was dying. A convenient thought, I'm sure. But as you can see, reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated. Her gaze settled on Sienna, pinning her with an unnerving intensity. And you, she said, her tone dripping with a sweet, venomous politeness, must be Sienna, the special lady from the flower shop. It's a pleasure to finally put a face to the hospitality. Anthony has always been so thoughtful about making his guests feel at home. Sienna's emerald eyes, which Lillian was sure were usually full of fire and defiance, were now wide with pure animal fear. She opened her mouth, but only a small choke sound emerged. Get dressed. Lillian's voice suddenly dropped the ironic pleasantry, vanishing, replaced by a tone of pure, unadulterated steel. The command was not a request. Both of you, now. Anthony, finally jolted from his stupor, began to bluster, his brain scrambling to find a foothold, a way to spin this narrative back into his control. Lillian, listen to me. Please. This isn't what it looks like. Let me explain. We can talk about this. A laugh escaped Lillian's lips. It was a startling sound in the heavy silence, short, sharp, and utterly devoid of humor. Explain. Oh, Anthony, I'm sure you could. You could sell ice in the Arctic. You've built an empire on your explanations, on your dazzling hollow promises. But the performance is over. I'm no longer your audience. She moved with a fluid grace, walking past him as if he were a piece of furniture. She approached the grand antique mahogany desk, her desk, the one that had belonged to her father. From her Chanel handbag, she produced a single, crisp white envelope and placed it squarely in the center of the polished wood. The gesture was theatrical, deliberate, final. This, she announced, her voice resonating with a cold legal finality, is a formal eviction notice. It gives you and your guest 24 hours to vacate the premises. Anthony stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled viper. The word eviction seemed to short-circuit his brain. Eviction, Lillian, be reasonable. This is my house. The words were a desperate, reflexive cry of a man whose power was slipping through his fingers like sand. Is it? Lillian tilted her head, her expression one of feigned curiosity. That's funny. I just reviewed the deed this morning. It must have been an oversight on your part, but your name appears absolutely nowhere on it. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She saw the recognition, the dawning horror in his eyes. The prenuptial agreement. The ironclad clause his lawyers had fought so hard against, the one Lillian had quietly, stubbornly insisted upon. A relic from a time when she was simply being prudent, never imagining she would one day wield it as a weapon. "Lillian, you can't be serious," he pleaded, his voice cracking, the powerful CEO replaced by a desperate, cornered man. "This is our home, our life." "No, Anthony," she corrected him, her voice dropping to an icy whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. She stepped closer to him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "This is my home, and you are no longer welcome in it." She turned her attention one last time to Sienna, who had managed to pull on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, looking small and pathetic without her borrowed silken armor. "As for you," Lillian said, her eyes raking over the younger woman with a look of withering dismissal, "I suggest you gather up your little trinkets, the shoes, the bags, whatever baubles he bought to purchase your silence and your company, and you disappear. Because I assure you, you do not want to be in this house when the sheriff's department arrives tomorrow at noon to escort any remaining trespassers from my property." The threat, delivered with such calm certainty, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The fantasy world Sienna had been living in shattered into a million pieces. The mansion, the couture, the future she had imagined, it was all a mirage. She was a trespasser, a temporary amusement. She shot a desperate, pleading look at Anthony, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He was a broken statue, his pedestal crumbling beneath him. Without another word, Lillian turned her back on them both. She walked out of the library, her posture erect, her steps measured and sure. She didn't slam the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The Queen had made her move. Checkmate. The subsequent 24 hours within the mansion were a frantic, suffocating hell. The opulent rooms that had been the backdrop for their illicit affair now felt like a gilded prison. Anthony, in a state of panicked disbelief, paced the marble floors like a caged animal. He made a flurry of calls, first to Lillian, which went straight to an emotionless voicemail. Then to his lawyers, a team of sharks who had navigated billion-dollar mergers for him. Their response was swift and unanimous. The deed was ironclad. The house was hers. He had no legal recourse. He was, in the eyes of the law, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. The passion between him and Sienna curdled into bitter, toxic recrimination. "How could you not tell me?" Sienna shrieked at him, her face streaked with tears and running mascara. "You let me believe this was our life. I never said it was our life." He shot back, his voice raw with desperation and self-loathing. "I said you could stay here, it was temporary. Did you really think I'd leave my wife for you?" The cruel words, spoken in a moment of pure panic, hung between them, ugly and irrevocable. Sienna began to pack a frantic, tearful tornado of activity. She threw clothes into a suitcase, her hands shaking as she realized the vast majority of the wardrobe in the closet was not hers. The Chanel bags, the Hermès scarves, the Cartier watch on her wrist, they were props in a play, and the play was over. They belonged to the role, not to her. The next day at precisely noon, a black and white cruiser from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department pulled silently through the main gates and up the driveway. Lillian was in her Bentley, parked across the street, watching from behind the tinted privacy glass. Her face was an impassive mask, her eyes hidden behind dark Dior sunglasses. She watched as Anthony and Sienna emerged from the front door, blinking in the harsh midday sun. They looked haggard and defeated. Anthony, usually impeccably dressed, was in a rumpled shirt, his face unshaven. Sienna, her fiery hair a mess, clutched a single overstuffed suitcase. They were no longer the golden couple from the poolside. They were two exiles banished from paradise. They walked down the driveway, their steps heavy with shame. As they passed her car to get into a waiting yellow cab, Anthony's head turned. For a split second, his eyes met hers through the glass. She saw in them a maelstrom of regret, loss, and a flicker of the man she had once loved. Sienna shot a look of pure, venomous hatred in her direction. Lillian didn't react. She offered no gesture, no word, no sign of triumph. She simply watched as the taxi pulled away, carrying the wreckage of her marriage down the sun-dappled street and out of her life. She had won. The house was hers. The victory was absolute. But as she put the Bentley in drive and pulled through the gates of her reclaimed kingdom, she felt no elation, only a profound, cavernous emptiness. The queen was back on her throne, but the castle felt cold and desolate, and the silence was the loudest sound of all. The fallout from that final frigid confrontation on Bellagio Road was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, seismic shockwave that radiated outward, cracking the polished veneer of Los Angeles's most elite circles. The story of Anthony and Lillian Hayes, whispered at first in hushed tones over clinking champagne glasses at a charity gala at the Getty, became a full-blown narrative, devoured by a society starved for high-stakes drama. It was the ultimate cautionary tale, a delicious cocktail of infidelity, hubris, and the quiet, unexpected power of a wife who held the ultimate trump card. Anthony, the titan of industry, the man whose name was etched onto the city's skyline, experienced a fall from grace so swift and so absolute it was almost biblical. The charisma that had once charmed investors and disarmed rivals now seemed like a cheap parlor trick. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of audacious deals and an unshakable self-belief, began to crumble. The Singapore project, the behemoth deal he had used as the very alibi for his deceit, was the first casualty. The consortium of international investors, men who prized stability and reputation above all else, grew skittish. The whispers of scandal of a messy public divorce were enough to make them pull back. The project was indefinitely stalled, a towering monument to his own spectacular failure. His calls to Lillian, once filled with blustering attempts at justification, then pleading, finally ceased altogether. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the specter of his public humiliation. He retreated from the public eye, his name disappearing from the society pages, and the business journals replaced by a void of speculation and rumor. He was a king without a kingdom, a man who had traded an empire for a fleeting, foolish dalliance. Sienna, the firecracker who had believed she was on the cusp of conquering Hollywood, found herself extinguished. The story had painted her not as a romantic heroine, but as a foolish, grasping opportunist. The producers who had once praised her star quality no longer returned her calls. The roles she was offered were no longer the complex leading ladies she had dreamed of, but bit parts caricatures of the other woman. The Bel Air dream dissolved into the harsh, unforgiving glare of the San Fernando Valley sun. She moved into a nondescript apartment complex in Sherman Oaks. The vibrant, expensive clothes she had left behind in Lillian's closet, a constant, bitter reminder of the life she had so briefly, so foolishly believed was hers. The Chanel bags and Harry Winston diamonds were gone, replaced by the crushing weight of her own naivete. She had flown too close to the sun, and the fall had scorched her wings. Meanwhile, Lillian became an enigma, a figure of quiet fascination. In a city that often celebrated the loudest voice in the room, her silence was deafening. She was the woman who had been profoundly wronged, but had refused to play the victim. She had not leaked stories to the press, had not engaged in a messy public battle. She had simply quietly and devastatingly reclaimed what was hers. Her strength was not in her anger, but in her control. She was a modern-day icon of resilience, a woman who had faced the ultimate betrayal and had emerged not with a thirst for vengeance, but with an unshakable sense of her own worth. But behind the imposing gates of the Bellagio Road mansion, the victor's spoils felt cold and hollow. The house, her masterpiece, her sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage of memory. Every room was a stage for a ghost play, scenes from a marriage that was now a lie. The scent of Sienna's perfume, a cloying sweet jasmine, seemed to have seeped into the very walls, a phantom presence she could not scrub away. She hired a professional cleaning crew, a team of discreet, efficient women who moved through the house like surgeons excising any trace of the other woman. They packed away the garish, out-of-place clothes, the unfamiliar cosmetics, the cheap novels left on the bedside table. They aired out the rooms, polished the floors until they gleamed, and replaced the tainted linens with crisp, clean fret sheets. Yet the house remained haunted. One afternoon, Lillian walked into the grand library, the heart of the home, the room where she and Anthony had spent countless hours, their lives intertwined like the intricate patterns on the Persian rug. She ran her hand along the worn leather of his favorite armchair and felt a wave of nausea. The betrayal was a physical presence, an invisible stain that no amount of cleaning could remove. The final straw came on a quiet Sunday morning. She walked into the master suite, the California sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She saw the bed, a vast expanse of white, and the image of Anthony and Sienna, their bodies entwined, flashed in her mind with searing, brutal clarity. The room, once a haven of intimacy and love, was now a crime scene. In that instant, a profound, unshakable clarity washed over her. She could not heal here. To stay would be to live forever in the shadow of her own heartbreak. That afternoon, she made a call that would sever the final tie to her old life. She contacted Eleanor Vance, a formidable real estate agent known for her discretion and her Rolodex of ultra-wealthy international buyers. "Eleanor, it's Lillian Hayes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm ready to sell." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Lillian Eleanor finally replied, her voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Lillian said, and the words felt like a liberation. The decision was a catalyst. It was a declaration of independence, a promise of a new beginning. She began the process of dismantling her life, of sorting through the accumulated artifacts of a 15-year marriage. It was a painful, cathartic archaeology. She unearthed old photo albums, the smiling faces of a younger, more hopeful version of herself, and Anthony staring back at her. There they were on their honeymoon in the Amalfi Coast, their faces alight with love and promise. There they were at the groundbreaking ceremony for Anthony's first skyscraper, his arm wrapped proudly around her shoulder. She looked at these images not with anger, but with a deep, aching sadness, a mourning for the love that had been lost, for the man Anthony had once been, or at least the man she had believed him to be. The divorce was a quiet, clinical affair. Anthony, a man stripped of his arrogance, was a ghost of his former self. He did not fight. He did not contest her terms. He signed the papers in his lawyer's office, his hand trembling slightly, his signature a final pathetic surrender. Lillian did not ask for a dime of his vast fortune. She had her own money, a substantial inheritance from her parents, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had always known her own worth. All she wanted was the house, the one asset that was unequivocally hers, and the freedom to walk away. With the mansion sold to a reclusive tech billionaire, and the divorce papers finalized, Lillian stood at a precipice. The map of her life, once so clearly defined, was now a blank page. The possibilities were terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was 42 years old, childless, and utterly, completely free. For weeks she drifted. She traveled, revisiting the places that held meaning for her, not as a wife, but as a woman alone. She walked the cobbled streets of Paris, spent a quiet week in a ryokan in Kyoto, and found a strange, stark beauty in the deserts of New Mexico. But she was searching for something more than a change of scenery. She was searching for a place to put down new roots, a place where the ghosts of her past could not find her. She remembered a dream she had once had long before Anthony, a dream of a simpler life, a life connected to the earth. She remembered her passion for architecture, not for the grand, opulent statements she had once designed, but for the quiet beauty of restoring something old, of breathing new life into forgotten spaces. And so, on a whim, guided by a deep, intuitive pull, she booked a flight to Florence. From there she rented a small Fiat and drove into the rolling hills of Tuscany, a landscape that seemed to have been painted by the old masters. She found it by accident, a small, neglected vineyard with a crumbling stone farmhouse. its windows like sad, empty eyes looking out over a valley of olive groves and cypress trees. The place was a ruin. The roof sagged, the fields were overgrown, and the air was thick with the dust of decades of neglect. But Lillian saw beyond the decay. She saw the good bones of the house, the ancient hand-carved stone, the terracotta tiles baked by centuries of sun. She saw the gnarled, forgotten vines and felt a deep, primal connection to the land. This was it. This was her new beginning. She bought the vineyard, a transaction that baffled her lawyer and her financial advisor. She traded the pristine, manicured perfection of Bel Air for the rustic, untamed beauty of the Italian countryside. She traded her Chanel suits for work boots and jeans, her Bentley for a dusty second-hand Land Rover. She threw herself into the restoration with a fierce, joyful abandon. She hired local artisans, weathered, taciturn men whose families had worked this land for generations. She communicated with them in her fluent, if slightly rusty Italian, a skill she had acquired during a year abroad in college. She worked alongside them, her hands once soft and manicured, now calloused and stained with paint and plaster. She was not just rebuilding a house. She was rebuilding herself. Each restored stone, each newly planted vine was a piece of her own fractured spirit being mended. She discovered a new rhythm to her days, one dictated not by social calendars and business meetings but by the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons. She found a quiet joy in the simple things, the taste of a sun-warmed tomato from her garden, the scent of lavender after a rainstorm, the shared laughter over a bottle of Chianti with her new neighbors. The past was not forgotten. The scars remained a faint silvery tracing on her heart, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a testament to her own resilience, a map of the journey that had brought her here. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Tuscan sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Lillian sat on the terrace of her newly restored farmhouse. A glass of wine from the first small harvest of her own grapes sat on the table before her. She looked out at the rolling hills, at the orderly rows of vines, at the ancient olive trees, their leaves shimmering like silver in the fading light. She thought of the woman she had been just a year ago, a woman fighting for her life in a sterile hospital room, her world about to shatter. And for the first time in a long, long time, she felt a profound and unshakable sense of peace. She had lost a husband, a home, a life she had thought was her destiny. But in the ashes of that life, she had discovered something far more valuable, something no one could ever take away from her herself. She was no longer Lillian Hayes, the wife of a magnate, the queen of a Bel Air castle. She was Lillian, a woman who had weathered the storm and had not only survived, but had learned how to thrive. The game was over, but her true life, she realized, had only just begun. So what do you do when the life you've built crumbles around you? Do you let the rubble bury you, or do you rise from the ashes and build something new, something stronger? Lillian's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. She walked away from the gilded cage, from the betrayal and the lies, and found her own kingdom not in the hills of Bel Air, but in the sun-drenched fields of Tuscany. It's a story of resilience, of the incredible strength of the human spirit to heal, to rebuild, and to find happiness in the most unexpected of places. The crystal champagne flutes of the exclusive Aria restaurant reflected a lie. For 10 years, Andrea had believed in the fairy tale, the whirlwind romance, the lavish wedding, the doting millionaire husband Jack. Tonight on their anniversary, surrounded by panoramic city views and the scent of $1,000 roses, that fairy tale was set to implode. He didn't just ask for a divorce. He had it served to her cold and final right between the appetizer and the main course. But the real gut punch wasn't the end of her marriage. It was the reason that showed up on her doorstep the very next morning in the arms of his sister. The air in their penthouse apartment, a sprawling expanse of glass and minimalist art overlooking Central Park, was always still. It was a manufactured tranquility curated by silent, efficient staff and the sheer sound-dampening quality of wealth. Andrea had once found it peaceful. Now it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a life that was technically hers, but felt increasingly alien. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window was that of a woman sculpted by privilege. Her dress, a sliver of silk from a designer whose name was a whisper among the elite, clung to a figure honed by personal trainers and a diet of organic, joyless greens. Her blonde hair, styled into effortless waves by a man who flew in from Paris twice a month, cascaded over one shoulder. She looked perfect. She felt hollow. Jack, her husband, was the architect of this gilded cage. Jack Westbrook, a name that echoed with the clatter of stock tickers and the hushed reverence of boardrooms. He hadn't just inherited wealth. He had multiplied it with a ferocity that bordered on demonic. He was a titan of industry, a man whose ambition was a roaring furnace that consumed everything in its path. Including Andrea was beginning to realize their marriage. Their love story had been the stuff of tabloids. The brilliant, ruthless billionaire and the quiet art history graduate who worked at a small gallery. He had pursued her with a single-minded intensity that had left her breathless. He'd filled her life with a dizzying array of luxuries, private jets to whisk them away to St. Bart's for a weekend front-row seats at every fashion week, and a black Amex card with a limit that was purely theoretical. He had built her a life most women only dreamed of, and for a long time she had loved him for it. She had mistaken his possessiveness for passion, his control for care. But 10 years was a long time. The grand gestures had slowly been replaced by a quiet, insidious control. Her friends, the ones from her pre-Jack life, had drifted away, intimidated by the sheer scale of her new world. Her career had been gently but firmly discouraged. "Why would you want to work, darling?" he'd murmured, "when you can have anything you desire." And so she had become another one of his beautiful acquisitions, a flawless object to adorn his perfect life. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion in the cavernous rooms of their home. Jack was always working. Even when he was physically present, his mind was elsewhere, lost in the complex calculus of mergers and acquisitions. Their conversations had become a series of perfunctory exchanges, a checklist of social obligations and household management. The passion that had once defined them had dwindled to a flicker, then to an ember, and now she feared to cold dead ash. Tonight was their 10th anniversary. A decade. It felt like a lifetime. Jack had, in his typical fashion, arranged everything. A reservation at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a public phone number. A new diamond necklace nestled in a velvet box on her vanity. Its brilliance a cold comfort. He was a master of the grand, empty gesture. As she fastened the clasp of the necklace, her fingers trembled slightly. She had tried in the beginning to bridge the growing chasm between them. She had planned romantic getaways only to have him cancel at the last minute for an urgent meeting. She had tried to talk to him to voice the gnawing emptiness in her heart, but her words seemed to bounce off the impenetrable wall of his indifference. He would listen with a placid smile, pat her hand, and tell her she was being overly emotional. Tonight, she had promised herself, would be different. Tonight, she would demand to be heard. She would tell him that she couldn't live like this anymore, a beautiful ghost in her own life. She wanted more than just his wealth. She wanted him. She wanted the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. She found him in his study, a room paneled in dark, imposing mahogany. A cigar in one hand, a glass of whiskey in the other. He was on the phone, his voice a low, commanding rumble. He didn't look up as she entered, just gestured for her to wait. The smoke from his cigar curled in the air, a pungent, acrid scent that seemed to suffocate her. When he finally ended the call, he turned to her, his eyes the color of a stormy sea sweeping over her in a quick, appraising glance. "You look stunning, Andrea." It was a statement of fact, not a compliment. "Happy anniversary, Jack," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He walked over to her and kissed her on the cheek, his lips cool and dry. "Happy anniversary, my love." The endearment was a reflex devoid of any real warmth. He picked up a sleek, leather-bound portfolio from his desk. "Shall we go? I have a surprise for you at the restaurant." The drive to Aria was silent. the city lights blurring past the tinted windows of the Maybach. Andrea's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She rehearsed the words she would say, the areas of her discontent she would finally perform. The restaurant was everything she had expected, opulent, hushed, and filled with the kind of people whose faces graced the pages of Forbes. They were led to a secluded table with a breathtaking view of the glittering skyline. The sommelier, a man with a ridiculously French name she couldn't pronounce, presented them with a bottle of champagne that cost more than her first car. Jack was in his element, charming and urbane, discussing wine vintages with the sommelier and nodding graciously to the other power players in the room. He was performing the role of the devoted husband, and he was doing it flawlessly. The first course arrived, a delicate arrangement of seafood and foam that looked more like a work of art than food. Andrea pushed it around her plate, her appetite gone. "Is something wrong, darling?" Jack asked. His brow furrowed in a convincing display of concern. "You're not eating." This was it. Her opening. "Jack, we need to talk." He sighed, a long theatrical exhalation of breath. "Andrea, not tonight. It's our anniversary." "That's why we need to talk," she insisted, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I can't do this anymore." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Do what exactly?" "This," she said, gesturing around them at the opulent surroundings. "This life. It's not real. We're not real." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I provide you with a life most people would kill for. You have everything you could ever want. I don't have you." The words burst out of her raw and wounded. "I'm so lonely, Jack. I feel like I'm drowning." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that chilled her to the bone. He smiled. It was a cold, cruel smile devoid of any humor. "You're right," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "This isn't working anymore." He reached for the leather portfolio he had brought with him and slid it across the table. "Happy anniversary, Andrea." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of crisp white paper, were divorce papers. Her name was printed in stark black ink, a final brutal testament to the end of their marriage. The room spun, the glittering city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of pain. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He was still smiling, that same chilling smile. "I've been planning this for months," he said, his voice a low, triumphant purr. "I just wanted to wait for the perfect occasion." The world tilted on its axis. The hushed whispers of the other diners faded into a dull roar in her ears. She felt a scream building in her throat, a primal sound of anguish and betrayal, but it was choked off by a wave of nausea. "Why?" She managed to whisper the word, a ragged, broken thing. "Because I'm bored, Andrea," he said, taking a sip of his champagne. "And because I found someone else. Someone who is more suitable." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He hadn't just ended their marriage. He had savaged it, leaving her emotionally eviscerated in the middle of a crowded restaurant. She felt the eyes of the other diners on her, their curious glances like tiny, sharp knives. She stood up, her legs unsteady. "I'm leaving." "Of course," he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "The driver is waiting outside. All of your things have been packed and sent to a storage facility. The penthouse is no longer your home. My lawyers will be in touch with yours." He had thought of everything. He had orchestrated her demise with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business dealings. She was just another asset to be liquidated. She walked out of the restaurant, her head held high, a queen abdicating her throne. She didn't look back. The tears came then, hot and furious, blurring the city lights into a watery abstraction. The doorman, a man who had greeted her with a deferential smile for years, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The driver, a man who had driven her to countless shopping sprees and charity luncheons, opened the door for her in silence. The Maybach, once a symbol of her gilded cage, was now her getaway car. As the car pulled away from the curb, she finally allowed herself to brake. The sobs racked her body, a violent, guttural outpouring of a decade of repressed emotions. She had been a fool. A naive, trusting fool. She had believed in a fairy tale, and he had turned it into a horror story. The car sped through the deserted streets of the city, carrying her away from the life she had known. A life that had been a beautiful, elaborate lie. She had no idea where she was going, what she would do. She had nothing. He had taken everything from her. Or so she thought. The true depth of his betrayal, the final devastating twist of the knife, was yet to come. It was waiting for her in the cold, sterile light of the morning. Part 2. The Unraveling of a Perfect Life. The key to the hotel suite felt foreign in her hand, a cold, impersonal piece of plastic. The hotel, a chic boutique establishment her friend Clara had booked for her in a frantic late-night phone call, was a world away from the opulent grandeur of the penthouse. The suite was stylish and modern, but it lacked the soulless perfection of Jack's world. Here there were signs of life of other people. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Andrea had spent the night in a daze, replaying the scene at the restaurant over and over in her mind. Jack's cold, triumphant smile was seared into her memory, a brand of his cruelty. The words he had spoken, each one a carefully chosen weapon, echoed in the silence of the hotel room. "I'm bored, Andrea. I found someone else. More suitable." Who was she? This more suitable woman. Was she younger, more beautiful, more ambitious? The question swirled in her mind, a venomous cocktail of jealousy and self-doubt. She had given him 10 years of her life, had molded herself into the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect accessory to his perfect life. And for what? To be discarded like a piece of last season's couture. Sleep had been a fleeting, tormenting thing, filled with nightmares of falling from great heights, of being trapped in a house of mirrors, her own reflection mocking her with Jack's cruel smile. She had woken up to the gray, unforgiving light of dawn, her body aching, her eyes swollen and raw from crying. She had called Clara, her one remaining friend from her pre-Jack life, a sharp, witty lawyer who had always been suspicious of Jack's manufactured charm. Clara had been a whirlwind of practical advice and fierce, unwavering support. "We'll fight him, Andrea," she had said, her voice a comforting balm on Andrea's raw nerves. "We'll take him for everything he's worth." But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the betrayal, the sheer calculated cruelty of it all. He had not just left her. He had tried to annihilate her. A knock on the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Clara was at her office, already mobilizing her legal team. She peered through the peephole and her blood ran cold. It was Josie, Jack's sister. Josie Westbrook was a woman who moved through the world with the same ruthless ambition as her brother. She was a venture capitalist. Her mind a steel trap, her heart. Andrea had always suspected, made of the same cold, hard material. She and Andrea had never been close. Josie had always looked at her with a thinly veiled condescension, as if she were a frivolous, decorative object that her brother had inexplicably acquired. What was she doing here? Had Jack sent her to deliver another blow, another calculated cruelty? Andrea's hand trembled as she unlocked the door. Josie stood in the hallway, a stark, imposing figure in a tailored pantsuit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, her face a mask of cool composure. But there was something different about her today. A flicker of something that looked like uncertainty in her usually unflappable demeanor. And in her arms, bundled in a soft cashmere blanket, was a baby. Andrea stared at the baby, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The baby was tiny, its face a perfect miniature version of... She couldn't quite place it. But there was a familiarity there, a ghost of a resemblance that sent a shiver down her spine. "Josie, what is this?" Andrea's voice was a hoarse whisper. Josie's composure seemed to crack then. Her carefully constructed mask of indifference crumbled, revealing a woman who looked lost and overwhelmed. "Andrea, I didn't know where else to go." She pushed past Andrea into the room, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She sank onto the sofa, the baby still cradled in her arms. The baby began to fuss, a small mewling sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. "Whose baby is this?" Andrea asked, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A terrible, preposterous thought began to form in her mind, a thought so monstrous she couldn't even give it voice. Josie looked up at her, her eyes so like her brother's, filled with a mixture of pity and something else, something that looked like guilt. It's Jax," she said, her voice barely audible. The world seemed to stop spinning. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, pressing down on Andrea with an unbearable weight. Jack's baby. The words reverberated in her mind, a discordant, shattering symphony. "But how?" Andrea stammered, her mind reeling. We couldn't have children." It had been the one unspoken sorrow in their otherwise perfect life. They had tried for years a grueling, emotionally draining journey of fertility treatments and dashed hopes. The doctors had never been able to find a specific reason, a cruel, unexplained infertility that had cast a long, dark shadow over their marriage. Jack had been surprisingly stoic about it, almost indifferent. "It doesn't matter, Andrea," he had said. "I have you. That's all I need." Another lie. Another one of his beautiful, hollow lies. "It's not your baby, Andrea," Josie said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's his. And hers." "Hers?" The word was a choked, strangled sound, the more suitable woman. "Her name is Olivia," Josie said, her gaze fixed on the baby in her arms. "She's a surrogate. Jack hired her a year ago." A year ago. The timeline was a brutal, unforgiving thing. A year ago they had still been married, still sharing a bed, still going through the motions of a life together. While she had been grieving their childless state, he had been creating a new life with another woman. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her. "Why are you here, Josie?" Andrea asked, her voice a hollow echo of her former self. "Why are you telling me this?" Josie finally met her gaze, and for the first time Andrea saw a flicker of something that looked like genuine remorse in her eyes. "Because he's gone, Andrea. He's left the country. He's on a plane to Dubai with her, Olivia." "He left? With the surrogate?" The words were absurd, a line from a bad soap opera. "Yes," Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. "He left me a note. He said he was starting a new life. He said the baby was my problem now." The sheer, unadulterated selfishness of it was breathtaking. He had not only betrayed his wife, but he had also abandoned his own child, leaving her in the care of his sister, a woman who looked as comfortable holding a baby as she would holding a ticking bomb. "He just left her?" Andrea asked, her voice laced with a horrified disbelief. "He said he had a new life to build, and a baby didn't fit into his plans." Josie said, her voice thick with a bitterness that surprised Andrea. "He said he had provided for her financially, and that was enough." The baby started to cry, then a full-throated, desperate wail. Josie looked down at her, her expression a mixture of panic and helplessness. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know how to take care of a baby." And in that moment something shifted in Andrea. The grief, the anger, the betrayal. It was all still there, a raging inferno in her chest. But something else was there too. A flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A sense of purpose. She looked at the crying baby. A tiny innocent life caught in the crossfire of her father's monstrous ego. This baby was a product of Jack's betrayal, a living, breathing symbol of his cruelty. But she was also an innocent, a victim in all of this. Andrea stood up and walked over to the sofa. She looked at Josie, a woman she had never liked, a woman who was a part of the family that had so callously discarded her. But in that moment she didn't see an enemy. She saw another woman, another victim of Jack's destructive ambition. "Give her to me," Andrea said, her voice surprisingly steady. Josie looked up at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and relief. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully, awkwardly handed the baby to Andrea. Andrea took the baby in her arms. She was so small, so fragile. Her tiny fists were balled up, her face red and scrunched up in a mask of distress. As Andrea held her, something miraculous happened. The baby stopped crying. She opened her eyes, and for the first time Andrea saw them clearly. They were the color of a stormy sea. Jack's eyes, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. It was a strange, confusing cocktail of love, hate, and a fierce, primal protectiveness. This baby was a part of him, a part of the man who had shattered her life. But she was also her own person, a tiny, innocent soul who deserved to be loved and cared for. And in that moment, looking down at the baby in her arms, Andrea knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to crumble. She wasn't going to let him win. She was going to fight. For herself, for her future, and for this tiny, innocent baby who had been so cruelly abandoned. The war had just begun. And she, Andrea Westbrook, was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. The first 72 hours with the baby were a descent into a chaotic, sleep-deprived hell. The chic hotel suite, once a sterile sanctuary, rapidly devolved into a command center for a tiny, tyrannical ruler named Lily. The air grew thick with the scents of baby powder and sour milk, the sleek glass tables cluttered with bottles, sterilizing equipment, and piles of muslin cloths. Silence became a forgotten luxury, replaced by a relentless cycle of wails, gurgles, and the frantic rustle of diaper changes. Andrea, still reeling from the psychological demolition of her marriage, found herself thrown into the trenches of newborn care with no training and no map. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Lily's needs were too immediate, too absolute. Each cry was a siren that jolted her from her stupor, forcing her into action. She moved like an automaton, her body aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical illness. In the dead of night, while rocking a screaming Lily, the sheer impossibility of it all would wash over her. She was a ghost of a wife, a stranger in a hotel, and now the sole guardian of a child born from her husband's ultimate betrayal. It was a reality so absurd, so cruel, that sometimes all she could do was hold Lily and weep silently along with her. And through it all, Josie stayed. She was a strange, spectral presence in their chaotic bubble. She would leave before dawn in her severe dark suits, a warrior heading to her own corporate battlefields, and return late in the evening to the domestic wreckage. Initially, she was paralyzed by the scene, hovering awkwardly by the door, as if unsure of her right to enter. Her attempts to help were both touching and comical. One evening, she arrived with a shopping bag from a designer children's boutique containing a pair of miniature leather shoes that cost more than Andrea's entire outfit, and a cashmere onesie utterly impractical for a baby. "I thought she might need these," Josie had said, a rare hint of uncertainty in her voice. Andrea, exhausted and covered in spit-up, had managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Josie. They're beautiful." The turning point came late one night. Andrea had finally managed to get Lily to sleep, collapsing onto the sofa, feeling the full weight of her despair pressed down on her. "I never understood it," Josie said quietly from an armchair across the room, making Andrea jump. "The desire for children. It always seemed like a liability, a distraction from what's important." "And what's important, Josie?" Andrea asked, her voice flat. "Power money. The Westbrook Empire." Josie flinched, but she didn't deny it. "That's what we were taught. Legacy. Assets." Jack didn't see a daughter. He saw an heir. He commissioned her like he would a new skyscraper. And when the project became inconvenient, he simply abandoned it and moved on to the next venture. She looked at Andrea, her composure finally cracking. "He's a monster, Andrea. He's my brother and I love him, but he's a monster. I'm so sorry it took me this long to truly see it. The raw confession hung in the air, a fragile offering. For the first time, Andrea saw past the corporate raider to the woman beneath, another victim of Jack's corrosive ambition. I see it now, too, Andrea whispered. I was just too blinded by the fairy tale to notice the rot underneath. In the daylight hours, Clara was their general, marshalling her forces with a terrifying fury. We're not just defending, we're documenting, she declared, her voice crisp over the phone. Every move they make, every threat, every lie. We build our case brick by brick. The first direct assault from Jack's camp arrived not as a phone call, but as a sleek black courier envelope delivered by a stone-faced messenger. It felt cold to the touch. Inside, on heavy cream-colored stationery, was a letter from Jack's legal team. Andrea read it, her blood turning to ice. The language was sterile, devoid of any humanity. It outlined the proposed settlement, a one-time payment that, while substantial to an ordinary person, was an insulting pittance from a man of Jack's staggering wealth. It was the financial equivalent of tossing a few coins to a beggar. But it was the paragraphs that followed that truly chilled her. The letter explicitly stated that Mr. Westbrook disavowed any and all paternal connection and responsibility for the child, referring to Lily only as the product of the surrogacy agreement. His generous one-time contribution to a trust fund was framed as a final act of charity, severing all ties. The final sentences were a masterclass in veiled intimidation, warning that if Andrea were to contest the more than reasonable offer or speak publicly about the private details of their separation, Jack would pursue all available legal avenues to protect his privacy and reputation. He's trying to buy her, then bury her, Andrea said, the paper trembling in her hand. He's trying to erase us. Clara's voice was grim. It's a declaration of war, Andrea, and he's just fired the first shot. The next salvo was even more vicious. Jack's lawyers filed a motion for an emergency custody hearing. Their claim was as outrageous as it was cruel. They argued that since Andrea had no biological relationship to Lily and was in a state of severe emotional distress, she was an unfit guardian. They petitioned the court to have Lily removed from her care and placed into the foster system pending a more stable, permanent solution. The cruelty was breathtaking. He would rather see his own daughter become a ward of the state than allow her to be raised by the woman he had spent a decade calling his wife. The courtroom was a sterile, wood-paneled arena where Jack's lawyers, a team of impeccably dressed sharks, began their systematic attempt to dismantle Andrea's character. They twisted her grief into hysteria, her love for Lily into a manipulative ploy for money. They questioned her stability, her motives, her sanity. Andrea sat beside Clara, her hands clenched in her lap, forcing herself to remain composed as they painted a grotesque caricature of her. But they had not counted on Josie. When she took the stand, a palpable hush fell over the courtroom. In her crisp suit, she was the very image of a Westbrook, powerful, articulate, and unflappable. But the words she spoke were a stunning betrayal of her own tribe. She calmly and methodically detailed her brother's plan, his cold-blooded hiring of the surrogate, and his final chilling act of abandonment. My brother Jack Westbrook, Josie stated, her voice clear and unwavering as she looked towards the judge, views this child not as a daughter but as a failed acquisition. He tasked me with her disposal. His exact words were, "She's your problem now." Josie's testimony was a powerful counterpunch, but the turning point came from a source none of them expected. A frantic, tearful voicemail was left on Clara's office line. It was Olivia, the surrogate. They arranged to meet in a quiet, anonymous cafe far from the media circus. Olivia was younger than Andrea had imagined, her eyes wide and haunted with a guilt that seemed too heavy for her slender frame. She hunched over her cup of tea, her story tumbling out in a torrent of shame and regret. "He was so charming at first," she sobbed, twisting a napkin in her hands. "Mr. Westbrook, Jack. He told me I was helping create a family. He said he and his wife had tried for years and this was their last hope. I thought I was doing a noble thing." She recounted how as the pregnancy progressed, Jack's charm had evaporated, replaced by an iron-fisted control. He had isolated her, monitored her diet, and treated her less like a person and more like a vessel he had leased. The luxury apartment he provided felt like a gilded cage. "The day she was born, he was so cold," Olivia whispered, tears streaming down her face. He held her for maybe a minute. There was no joy, no love. He just looked at her, at Lily, like she was a product he was inspecting for flaws. Then he handed her back to me and said, "My work here is done." The next day he was gone. The money was in my account, and he was just gone. Olivia had been terrified and alone. When she saw the news reports of the custody battle of Jack's lawyers trying to paint Andrea as an unstable gold digger and have Lily taken into care, she knew she couldn't stay silent. "He's a liar," Olivia said, her voice shaking with a newfound anger. "He's trying to hurt you, and he's using her to do it. His own baby." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "He said he wanted updates. I recorded some of our calls. I don't know if this will help, but—" Clara took the phone. They listened, huddled together in the booth, as Jack's voice filled the small space, cold, detached, and utterly damning. In one recording made just weeks before Lily was born, Olivia asked him if he was excited to finally be a father. "Excitement is an inefficient emotion, Olivia," Jack's recorded voice replied coolly. "This is a transaction. You are fulfilling your side of the contract, and I am fulfilling mine. Once the asset is delivered, our business is concluded." The asset is delivered. It was the smoking gun. Back in court, Olivia's testimony was a bombshell. She was visibly terrified on the stand, but as she recounted her story, her voice grew stronger. When Clara played the recording for the court, a gasp rippled through the gallery. Jack's lawyers objected furiously, but the judge overruled them, her face a thunderous mask of contempt. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave. The judge, a formidable woman named Judge Carroll, delivered her ruling with a sharp, unequivocal fury. She looked directly at Jack's lead counsel. "In my 15 years on the bench, I have seen a great deal of callousness, but Mr. Westbrook's behavior represents a new and despicable low." She then turned her gaze to Andrea, and for the first time her expression softened with something that looked like empathy. "This court's primary concern is, and always will be, the well-being of the child. It is abundantly clear that this child, against all odds, has found a loving and stable home with Ms. Westbrook." She awarded temporary sole custody to Andrea, her gavel striking the wood with a crack of finality. It was a stunning victory. As the courtroom emptied, Andrea finally let go, sobbing into Clara's shoulder. Not tears of sadness, but of profound, bone-deep relief. That night, back in the quiet of the hotel suite, she held a sleeping Lily in her arms, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She had won. She had protected this child. But as she looked out at the glittering, indifferent city, she knew this was not the end. She had publicly humiliated a man like Jack Westbrook. She had exposed him, wounded him. And a wounded predator she knew was the most dangerous animal of all. The storm had passed for now. But the war had just begun. The judge's words awarding her temporary custody echoed in the silent hotel suite long after Andrea had returned from court. It was a victory, a significant one, but it didn't feel triumphant. It felt like a brief, desperate gasp of air before being plunged back under the waves. The war was far from over. This was just one battle won. The media frenzy, which had briefly shifted in her favor, was a fickle beast, its cameras and microphones a constant looming presence outside her temporary home. They were vultures circling, waiting for the next dramatic turn, the next scrap of her life to devour. The financial strain was a constant gnawing anxiety. Clara's legal team was a fortress, but fortresses were expensive to maintain. Jack's lawyers, operating with a seemingly bottomless war chest, were masters of attrition. They buried them in motions, appeals, and procedural delays, each one costing time and money Andrea simply didn't have. She began the painful process of liquidating her old life piece by piece. The first to go was a Cartier watch, a third anniversary gift. Then a string of pearls from a trip to Japan. Each sale felt like severing a jeweled chain that had bound her to Jack. It was a bitter yet deeply liberating exorcism. She was trading the gilded remnants of her past for a chance at a future. In the midst of this turmoil, a strange, fragile domesticity began to bloom within the walls of the suite. Lily was the sun around which their new misshapen planet revolved. Her gurgles and coos were the soundtrack to their days, her sleepy sighs, the benediction of their nights. She was a constant, demanding, beautiful reality that grounded Andrea, pulling her back from the edge of despair whenever the legal battle threatened to consume her. Josie remarkably remained. She had shed her severe pantsuits for softer knits, her hair often escaping its tight chignon. She was still hopelessly awkward around Lily, holding her as if she were a delicate, ticking explosive. But she was present. She would return from her own punishing days at the office and sit quietly on the sofa, watching Andrea feed or bathe the baby, a complex, unreadable emotion in her stormy Westbrook eyes. It wasn't just guilt or pity. It was a kind of wistful curiosity, as if she were observing a life she never knew could exist. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of depositions where Jack's lawyers had tried to paint her as mentally unstable, Andrea was at her breaking point. Lily was wailing inconsolable with colic, and Andrea's own tears began to fall, silent drops of exhaustion and frustration. Josie, who had been hovering uselessly in the doorway, stepped forward. "Give her to me," she said, her voice softer than Andrea had ever heard it. Hesitantly, Andrea passed the screaming infant into her sister-in-law's arms. Josie surprisingly didn't flinch. She began to pace the room, humming a low, tuneless melody, something from a forgotten childhood. And miraculously, Lily's cries began to subside, her tiny, racked body relaxing against the unfamiliar shoulder. Andrea watched, stunned, as Josie soothed the child to sleep. In that quiet moment, a silent, unspoken bridge was built between the two women, an alliance solidified not in a boardroom, but in a nursery. The calm was shattered a few nights later. The phone rang, an unknown number flashing on the screen. A cold dread snaked up Andrea's spine. She answered, her hand trembling. "Andrea!" The voice was a distorted electronic rasp, but it was unmistakably him. "Jack." The air left her lungs. "What do you want, Jack?" Her voice was a fragile whisper. "I want you to stop." He hissed, the sound venomous even through the speaker. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're ruining me, my business, my reputation. You're destroying everything I've worked for." The sheer audacity of his victimhood was staggering. "You did that to yourself, Jack," she said, a flicker of her old fire returning. "You did this when you lied, when you cheated, when you abandoned your own child." A low, menacing laugh echoed down the line. "My child. That thing that was a means to an end, Andrea. An heir. A detail. And you were supposed to be a detail too. A beautiful, quiet one. You were never supposed to fight back." The cruelty of his words stole her breath, but she refused to let him hear her falter. "Well, I am fighting back." "You think you've won, don't you?" He sneered, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You think you can take what's mine and build a new life on the rubble of the one I gave you. You're a fool, Andrea. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't over." "Is that a threat, Jack?" "It's a promise." He said the words dripping with malice. "I'm going to take everything from you. I'm going to make you wish you had never ever met me." The line went dead, leaving only a dial tone that buzzed with menace. Andrea sank into a chair, her body shaking uncontrollably. The fear was real, a primal terror that Jack, with his infinite resources and non-existent conscience, could make good on his promise. But beneath the fear, something else was crystallizing. A cold, hard anger. He hadn't just threatened her. He had threatened Lily. He had called his own daughter a thing. The last vestige of the woman who had loved Jack Westbrook died in that moment, replaced by a warrior. The next morning she met with Clara and Josie. Her eyes were hard, her voice steady. "He called me," she said, relaying the conversation word for word. "He's not going to stop. We can't keep fighting a defensive war. It's time to attack." Clara leaned forward, her expression grim. "Andrea, that's a dangerous path. If we go public with what we have on his business dealings, we unleash a whirlwind. There's no coming back from that." "He's left us no choice," Josie interjected, her voice sharp with a businesswoman's pragmatism. "My brother only understands one thing: overwhelming force. He sees this as a hostile takeover of his life. We need to initiate a leveraged buyout of our own." She had a file in her hands, a thick manila folder she placed on the table. "I have contacts. People Jack has burned over the years. Disgruntled board members, cheated partners. They've been waiting for a moment of weakness. This is it." Andrea looked at the file, then at the two women beside her. This was her decision. She thought of Lily asleep in the next room, so innocent and unaware. She thought of Jack's voice calling his own daughter a thing. "Do it," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Burn it all to the ground." What followed was a masterfully executed corporate assassination. Clara and Josie orchestrated the release of information with surgical precision. They didn't just leak documents, they crafted a narrative. The story wasn't just about a messy divorce. It was a saga of corporate malfeasance, insider trading, and ruthless intimidation, with Jack Westbrook as the villain at its center. They fed the story to a respected investigative journalist, ensuring it had credibility. The explosion was nuclear. Headlines screamed from every newsstand. Financial news networks ran round-the-clock coverage of the implosion of Westbrook Enterprises. The stock didn't just plummet. It ceased to exist. The board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, ousted him. Federal investigators, armed with the information Andrea and Josie had provided, descended on his offices. His empire, the monument to his ego he had built over a lifetime, crumbled to dust in a matter of days. In the midst of this public immolation, another unexpected visitor appeared at their door. It was Olivia. She looked different from the frightened young woman in the coffee shop. There was a new strength in her eyes, a quiet determination. "I saw the news," she said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I've been doing a lot of thinking." She looked at Andrea, her gaze direct and full of a raw, painful honesty. "When I gave birth to Lily, I thought my job was done. I took the money because I was desperate, and I told myself it was for the best. But I was wrong. I see how you are with her. I see the pictures of you, and you're her mother." Tears welled in Andrea's eyes. "Olivia, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Olivia insisted, her voice gaining strength. "He paid me to have a baby, but he can't buy my silence, and he can't buy my rights. And he can't take away the fact that I am her mother, too." She took a deep breath. "I'm filing for parental rights, not to take her from you, to share her with you. I want us to be her mothers, together." The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and its grace. A family formed not by convention, but by the shared love for a child abandoned by her father. Their final day in court felt different. It was no longer an adversarial battleground. It was the formal recognition of a truth that had already been established. Andrea and Olivia stood side by side, a united front. The judge, the same stern woman from before, looked down at them, her expression softening. She read the documents from Olivia's lawyer, her eyes scanning the unprecedented request for joint legal custody. "In all my years on the bench," the judge said, her voice resonating with a quiet awe, "I have never seen a situation quite like this. A child brought into the world under a contract, abandoned by her father, and then embraced by two women who have every reason to be enemies." She looked directly at Andrea, then at Olivia. "What you have done is create a family where there was none. You have chosen love over bitterness and cooperation over conflict. This court is not only pleased, but honored to grant this request. As for Jack, he vanished. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Rumors occasionally surfaced of him being spotted in countries with no extradition treaties, a fallen king living in self-imposed exile. He had tried to destroy Andrea, but like a phoenix, she had risen from the ashes of the life he had burned down, stronger and more radiant than before. Months later, on a bright sunny afternoon, Andrea sat on a blanket in Central Park. The city skyline, once a symbol of her gilded cage, now felt like a backdrop to her freedom. Beside her, Olivia was showing Lily how to make a flower chain. A short distance away, Josie, looking surprisingly at ease in jeans and a sweater, was engaged in a serious phone call, but she kept glancing over, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. Lily, taking a wobbly, triumphant step, tumbled into Andrea's arms, giggling. Andrea held her close, burying her face in her daughter's soft curls, breathing in the scent of sunshine and innocence. This life was chaotic, unconventional, and utterly unpredictable. It wasn't the fairy tale she had once been sold. It was something far more real and infinitely more precious.